Welcome to my channel, The Good Book Tales. In today's story, we journey into the bustling streets of Jericho, a place alive with noise, trade, and whispers of something extraordinary. Word had spread like wildfire through the city. People hurried through narrow pathways, leaving their daily tasks behind, just to catch a glimpse of the man everyone was talking about, Jesus of Nazareth. Some called him a teacher, others a prophet, and many believed he was the Messiah. Curiosity, hope, and excitement filled the air, as if the whole city was holding its breath. But in the middle of this crowd, there was one man who wanted to see Jesus more than anyone else, and his name was Zacchaeus. Now Zacchaeus was not like everyone else. He was a wealthy tax collector, and in those days, tax collectors were not popular. People often disliked them, even despised them, because they were seen as greedy and unjust. But Zacchaeus was determined. Despite his wealth and his position, something deep inside him stirred whenever he heard the name of Jesus. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was a longing he could not explain. But whatever it was, it pushed him into the crowded streets that day, ready to do whatever it took just to see this man who was changing lives everywhere he went. The problem was, Zacchaeus was short in height. No matter how much he tried to stretch, tiptoe, or push through the crowd, the sea of people ahead blocked his view. The more he tried, the more impossible it seemed, and yet he couldn't give up. He had come too far. He had to see Jesus for himself. You can almost imagine him looking around in desperation, searching for a way, any way, to overcome the obstacle in front of him. That's when his eyes landed on something that would change everything, a large sycamore tree standing tall along the roadside. Think about it for a moment. Here was a man known for his wealth, power, and influence, a man many people looked at with suspicion or even hatred. Yet on this day, none of that mattered. Zacchaeus was willing to set aside his pride and do something that might make others laugh at him. He ran ahead of the crowd, climbed up that sycamore tree, and positioned himself among its branches. From there, he finally had a clear view of the road where Jesus would soon pass by. The excitement grew louder as the crowd pressed forward. Children shouted, women leaned forward, and men craned their necks to catch a glimpse. And there, high up in the tree, Zacchaeus waited, his heart racing. What would happen when Jesus arrived? Would he pass by without noticing? Would Zacchaeus get lost in the sea of faces? Or would something far more unexpected take place? As the footsteps of the crowd grew closer and the voice of Jesus echoed through the streets, Zacchaeus held his breath, unaware that this moment was about to change his life forever. The sound of footsteps grew stronger as the crowd pushed through the streets of Jericho, their voices rising with every moment. Zacchaeus clung to the branches of the sycamore tree, the rough bark pressing into his hands, but he hardly noticed. His eyes were fixed on the road below, his heart beating faster with each passing second. From up there, he could see everything: men, women, children, merchants leaving their shops, and travelers who had stopped to join the growing crowd. But most of all, he was waiting to see Jesus of Nazareth, the man whose name stirred emotions he couldn't quite explain. Zacchaeus had heard stories before this day. People spoke of miracles, of the blind who were given sight, of the lame who walked, and of the hopeless who suddenly found joy again. Some claimed he spoke with an authority that no ordinary teacher ever had. Others whispered that his words touched hearts in ways money and power never could. Zacchaeus listened to these stories in silence, but deep inside, something began to awaken. Despite his wealth, despite the respect, or perhaps fear, that came with being a chief tax collector, he knew there was still an emptiness in his life. All the silver and gold he had gathered could not fill the longing that grew inside his heart. And yet, seeing Jesus was not so simple. Zacchaeus knew what people thought of him, As a tax collector working under the Roman system, many of his neighbors saw him as a traitor. The scorn in their eyes, the whispers behind his back, the way people avoided him in the marketplace, all of it weighed heavily on him, even if he pretended not to care. Climbing the sycamore tree was more than a clever way to see over the crowd. It was also an escape. From up high he could look down without the sting of those judging stares. But there was also a risk. What if Jesus noticed him and turned away? What if the crowd mocked him for climbing a tree like a child? Still, Zacchaeus stayed, gripping the branches, determined not to miss this chance. Below, the crowd surged forward. The sound of people calling out grew clearer. He could hear Jesus' voice now, calm, steady, yet powerful enough to carry above the noise. Every word seemed to silence the hearts of those listening. Zacchaeus leaned further, his eyes straining to see the man at the center of it all. Then it happened. The crowd began to slow. Jesus was drawing nearer to the very tree where Zacchaeus was perched. The air grew heavy with anticipation. Zacchaeus' breath caught in his throat. Would Jesus simply pass by, lost in the sea of faces? Or would he look up and see the man no one else wanted to see? The moment was approaching, and Zacchaeus could feel that nothing in his life would ever be the same again. From his place in the branches, Zacchaeus felt the weight of his choices pressing in on him. The main conflict was not just about seeing Jesus. It was about the life he had lived until now. He had wealth, but he also carried the heavy burden of being hated by his own people. Every coin he collected as a tax collector reminded him of the distance between himself and the community he longed to belong to. The very crowd below, pushing and straining to see Jesus, was the same crowd that would turn their backs on him, whispering his name with bitterness. Yet here he was, desperate to see the man everyone called a friend of sinners. Could there be hope even for him? As Jesus drew closer, the noise of the crowd swelled. Some shouted in excitement, while others murmured with skepticism. To some, Jesus was a source of healing and hope. To others, he was a disruption to the order they were used to. Zacchaeus watched the faces of the people below, some glowing with faith, others tense with doubt. In their reactions, he saw his own inner struggle mirrored back at him. Would this man accept him, or turn him away like the rest? Meanwhile, on the ground, a group of men argued about Zacchaeus himself. One pointed up at the tree with a laugh, mocking the sight of the wealthy tax collector scrambling like a child. Another shook his head, disgusted, and muttered that a man like him didn't deserve to even look at Jesus. Their voices stung Zacchaeus, but he stayed hidden in the branches, gripping tighter, unwilling to give up. And yet, deep in his heart, he knew the moment of truth was almost here. Jesus was steps away, and Zacchaeus could feel the tension rising, as if the whole city of Jericho was waiting to see what would happen when their paths finally crossed. The crowd grew louder, their voices mixing into a roar that echoed through the streets of Jericho. Zacchaeus, still hidden among the branches of the sycamore tree, leaned forward as far as he could without losing his balance. His heart pounded in his chest, faster and harder with every step Jesus took toward him. He had never felt this way before, caught between fear and longing, between shame and hope. All around him, people were pressing in, stretching their arms toward Jesus, desperate for even the smallest touch. Yet Zacchaeus stayed apart, watching from above, afraid to be seen, yet unable to look away. Every sound, every movement seemed sharper in that moment. A child cried out in excitement, a woman's voice trembled as she whispered prayers, and men called out Jesus' name with urgency. Zacchaeus could see it all, the joy, the desperation, the wonder, and he realized how far he stood from all of it. Wealth had given him power, but it had also left him on the outside of moments like these. And now, for the first time, he wondered if this climb into the tree was not only about seeing Jesus, but also about finally being seen. Jesus was closer now. The crowd slowed. almost parting naturally around him. Every eye turned to follow his steps, as if the world itself held its breath. Zacchaeus clutched the branches so tightly his hands ached. He tried to steady his breathing, but the tension inside him kept rising. What if Jesus passed by without a glance? What if he looked up and condemned him in front of everyone? The footsteps stopped. Silence fell, heavy and expectant. And then, in that stillness, Jesus lifted his head and looked directly toward the tree where Zacchaeus was waiting. For a moment, time itself seemed to stop. Zacchaeus froze in the branches, his breath caught in his chest, as Jesus' eyes locked on him. The crowd stirred in confusion, whispers spreading like ripples through water. Why would Jesus pause here, at the base of a sycamore tree? Dozens of faces turned upward, and suddenly Zacchaeus was no longer hidden. Every mocking laugh, every suspicious glare was aimed at him, and the shame he had carried for years threatened to crush him in that instant. Then came the words no one expected. Jesus lifted his voice, steady and clear, calling out, "Zacchaeus, come down at once. Today I must stay at your house." The crowd gasped. Some shouted in disbelief, others murmured in anger. How could this great teacher, this man so many believed to be the Messiah, choose to stay with a tax collector? To them, Zacchaeus was a sinner, unworthy of honor, unworthy even of notice. Yet Jesus not only noticed him, he called him by name. Zacchaeus' hands trembled as he scrambled down the tree, nearly stumbling as he reached the ground. His heart raced, not from the climb, but from the unexpected grace that had just been spoken over him. He stood before Jesus, unable to hide, his pride stripped away by the weight of such mercy. In that moment, the conflict within him broke open. The wealth he once clung to so tightly now felt small compared to the chance to be accepted, to be changed. The crowd muttered, their disbelief rising, but Zacchaeus raised his voice above them all. "Lord," he said, his voice shaking, "I will give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anyone, I will repay them 4 times the amount." Gasps filled the air again, but this time not with scorn. This time with shock at the sincerity that poured from him. Jesus smiled, his words cutting through the tension like light breaking through clouds. "Today, salvation has come to this house." The murmuring quieted, the crowd silenced, stunned by what had just unfolded. But the twist came in the silence that followed. For as the people stood amazed, a voice from the back called out, "If salvation can reach Zacchaeus, then what about us? What about me?" The crowd turned, and suddenly the story was no longer only about Zacchaeus. It was about everyone standing there, each heart confronted by the same question. What would they do when seen by the eyes of Jesus? The tension had shifted. The man in the tree was no longer the only one exposed. Now, the whole crowd felt the weight of the moment, as if their own lives were hanging in the balance. The crowd stood still, their murmurs fading into silence as Jesus' words hung in the air. Zacchaeus, once the man everyone avoided, now stood before them, humbled and transformed. His promise to give to the poor and repay those he had wronged was more than empty words. It was proof of a heart that had been touched deeply. For the first time, the people saw not just the tax collector they despised, but a man willing to change, a man seen and valued by Jesus of Nazareth. Slowly, the tension in the air softened. Some in the crowd lowered their eyes, realizing that the moment was not just about Zacchaeus, but about them as well. The question whispered from the back, "What about me?" still lingered in every mind. If Zacchaeus could be given a new chance, then perhaps hope was not as far from their own lives as they once believed. In that realization, Jericho's busy streets, filled with trade and noise, suddenly felt like holy ground, a place where lives were being reshaped. Zacchaeus walked beside Jesus with a new lightness, as though the weight of years of guilt and loneliness had finally lifted. His wealth, once his identity and his shield, no longer held the same power over him. What mattered now was the chance to start again, to live differently, to be a man of generosity rather than greed. The crowd followed, some still puzzled, others inspired, but none unmoved by what they had witnessed beneath the branches of that sycamore tree. As the day drew on, the story of Zacchaeus spread quickly. People spoke not only of what he had said, but of the way Jesus had seen him, seen beyond the labels, beyond the mistakes, beyond the reputation. And in every retelling the message grew clearer. No one is too far, no one is too hidden, no one is too unworthy to be reached by grace. In the end, the man who climbed a tree just to catch a glimpse of Jesus had found far more than he ever expected. He had found acceptance, forgiveness, and a new beginning. And for the people of Jericho, and for us, the story of Zacchaeus remains a reminder that change is possible, that hope can appear in the most surprising places, and that when we are seen by the eyes of compassion, our lives can never be the same again.